So one of the pressing challenges the US is facing today is the future of the liberal order. Now, if you look at this Venn diagram, you see how the liberal order is comprised of. So it's really a combination of countries, institutions, military alliances. And the US, as you can see, is at the core of it. So we're looking at over 50 countries, members of more than one group. So they have overlapping memberships in alliances, institutions, trade agreements, etc. And then if you're looking at those countries, looking at Belgium, Germany, Australia, Cyprus, Britain, France, and the US, we see that liberal traits, they're not randomly distributed in that particular order, but really concentrated right here. So it's not a coincidence that all those liberal democracies are very much part of the liberal order, which was created and upheld by the United States in the mid-20th century. Now, international relations theory, Immanuel Kant, of course, looking at the Kantian triangle of peace, would argue that this is exactly what we're seeing with the liberal order. We have international organizations, we have economic interdependence between these countries, and all of them are liberal democracies. That combination of that creates not only order and stability, but more importantly, it creates sustainable peace. All of this has been upheld and defended, to the most part, by the United States since 1945, right? Establishment of the United Nations, NATO, then of course it comes to the European Union, World Trade Organization, World Bank, IMF, all of that is part of that triangle. Now, the question we are seeing now and we are facing is what happens if the US were to be removed from this, which is curious because the US is the one who created it and the US is also the country which benefits the most from it. So without the linchpin, what would happen? Would the order collapse? And then also, what would happen if US democracy were to decline? And that's, of course, a question which we've asked ourselves the last couple of years. If you're looking at IR experts, and American public alike think that the US is less respected today than it was previously. So this is a poll from 2017. The confidence in the president and also favorable views of the United States have also declined. So a lot of countries, including allies, in fact, see the US more of a threat than a sort of benevolent power. And again, this is a poll from 2018. Now, if you're looking at the liberal piece, so we have, sort of three watershed events. The rapid spread of liberalism after 1945, so the end of fascism in Europe, Imperial Japan. So we see the third wave, second wave of democratization. Liberal democracy wins. In 1990, so the end of the Cold War, the decline of the Soviet Empire, and of course decline of communism, and with not only liberal democracy, but of course capitalism itself. And then we see the expansion of the European Union eastward and the expansion of NATO eastward. This entire period overlaps with US dominance. So of course there seems to be a clear correlation, if not causation, to those three events. Now the US itself is of course founded on Lockean principles. So, the idea that, there is this social contract between the government and society also had, as we've seen throughout this course, also applied to US foreign policy. So again, the US tried, somewhat imperfectly, to spread and support these liberal principles across the globe. Now, the question is, what happens if the US is no longer the pinnacle of the international system? Will these values continue to rise, or in fact, will they wither away? Will they decline with it? One way of looking at that, and this is with international relations, it's difficult to predict what will happen in the future, and we always have to look at what sort of historical precedent can we look at and sort of compare it with. Of course, if you're looking at the British Empire, that would be the most recent reference point for us. Looking at 1921, the empire was at the peak and the British ruled about a quarter of the land on earth. If you're looking at today, Queen Elizabeth II remains a monarch in only 15 Commonwealth countries in addition to the UK. Here shows you a good sort of timeline of how the British Empire gradually withered away. So, Britain lost empire, obviously, 1783. The US formally left the empire, Ireland, Egypt. Then comes, the decolonization movement beginning with the end of the Second World War. Of course, the most important one, India, being 1947. Then we're looking at the Caribbean, African countries in particular, in the 60s, as well as late 60s, 70s, part of Asia too. So Britain seems to be sort of the last reference point with, what happens if an empire dwindles. A lot of that has to do with the Great Game as a sort of historical reference point for us. And the Great Game shows us how international hierarchy may interact with a domestic context to bring about the demise of a global power. The Great Game really relates to how Britain was awfully anxious about what Russia was doing in Asia. And of course, Britain was always very worried about, the threat to India, and the threat to India from Russia would have to come via Afghanistan. What Britain did, of course, was the idea was, well, we have to defend and, for that matter, invade and control Afghanistan in order to defend and balance, in particular, against the Russians. Now, again, the thing is, Russia really never considered it, but Britain poured a ton of resources, suffered a lot of military losses in Afghanistan, which quite, rightly it's called the graveyard of empires, and the United States just now again, and NATO countries, have seen it why it's called the graveyard for the last 20 years. So it's a very inhospitable terrain and impossible to control, in particular for outside intervening, occupying power, as the US was seen and as Britain was seen during that time. So the Great Game was this domestic push in Britain by politicians to balance against Russia in Afghanistan. A lot has to do with the Thermopylae myth, which is difficult to pronounce. And it goes back to King Leonidas. As you've seen, you might have seen the 300 movie, which is obviously a very fictional adaptation. But the historical story is that King Leonidas of Sparta defended a very, very narrow mountain path with roughly 1,000 soldiers, including 300 Spartans, against the invading Persian army. It was a very narrow passage, which allowed the Spartans to really fight against, in numerical terms, a much greater Persian army, and depleted the Persian army to so much that the remaining Greek city-states eventually could repel the invaders. Now, of course, Persia in the end still managed to overrun much of Greece in the end, but this sort of myth has really impacted and affected countries throughout. In particular, if you're looking at US foreign policy, the idea has always been we must confront the enemy there. So we have to fight the Persians at that passage rather than fight them on our own territory at home. So that has certainly the British have sort of adopted that throughout the 19th century, and also the United States throughout the 20th century. Looking at Vietnam, part of the whole Cold War doctrine was we mustn't let Vietnam fall. Vietnam was really unimportant as far as the global balance of power against the Soviets was concerned. But the United States lost over 61 million soldiers, and over 1 million Vietnamese died in that conflict. In the end, of course, they lost. So policymakers are being trapped by these myths and really perpetuating ineffective and failed policies. All the way, we're looking really the ancient Greek city-states starting it all. Now, if you look at the decline of the British Empire, so 1905, you're looking at the sort of tipping point for decline. They reached parity with Russia and Germany, but they're focused on the wrong competitor. Russia really lacked the very rural, agricultural, driven society. They lacked the competitiveness, but the Second World War, of course, the First World War, of course, showed that Germany was the rising power, not Russia. And then we had independence movements in Australia and Ireland. And then, of course, we had Britain's own population decline. And then we had, domestic politics. And you see that domestic politics and decision making by political leaders is very, very important in international relations. And particular, looking at the decline of the British Empire. So we had the Liberal Party in the UK at the time. They implemented policies that would attempt to hamper military and economic growth of competitors. And there really was this belief that if these countries were sufficiently constrained, they would not overthrow the British system. And then we had, diplomatic, economic, military punishments. They, of course, were implemented by the British, government, but they did not stop these rising capabilities. Instead, they served to increase the dissatisfaction and the likelihood of conflict. There was a lot of emphasis on offshore balancing, because offshore balancing was seen as sort of a cheaper way to keep, those rising powers away. Prime Minister Gladstone, really oversaw inadvertently the slow dissolution of the empire, because he thought once we give those newly independent former colonies, the independence, and we rely on their military power to, balance against our enemies, it would save us a lot of money. But of course, once they were independent, they were independent. They didn't want to do their bidding for the British colonial rulers anymore. And Britain, in the end, had to do it themselves. And as a result, were highly overstretched. And it drained a lot of resources at the time. Then, of course, we had the very punitive post-World War I environment for Germany. That, of course, did not prevent the challenges to the British order, but in that the opposite, we had a very dissatisfied challenge in the form of Nazi Germany. And then, of course, we had Chamberlain's failure of trying to appease Hitler and Nazi Germany, and that only did the opposite. It made Nazi Germany more aggressive. And then, of course, there was this attempt to offshore balance also, again, the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany. So all of that completely fell apart. It was, massive failure. So if you're looking at the solid line represents the proportional difference between Britain and the closest competitor, and the other line shows the United States between 1991 and 2016. Now, if you're looking at US decline, we have three important elements. Geography matters. Domestic, political, and economic conditions are the sources of state power. And then challenger states are neither inherently satisfied nor dissatisfied. And the action of the dominant states may augment their level of satisfaction. So again, whatever the US is doing has an impact on how satisfied or how upset those rising powers are. So if you're looking at geography, looking at China, of course, China is seen as the most pressing peer competitor as far as the US is concerned. We see these attempts by China to expand this sphere of influence. One, of course, we have the Belt Road initiative, which is connecting European, Asian, African markets to Asia to China. It's a massive infrastructure process, a project, and of course very closely tied to Chinese foreign policy and Chinese security policy. However, unlike Germany and Russia at the time during the British Empire, China is really a geographically maritime state. China will not remain a land-centric power. They're already building a blue water navy. So, they only have one destroyer right now, but soon they will have a lot more, and they will be able to project power from afar across the world, much like the United States. We've seen conflicts with India over territory and shipping lanes. We had, one particular, if you're looking at that image on the right, a border dispute between China and India last year. Now, since India is very friendly with the United States, one policy which seems very tempting to US policymakers will be, again, offshore balancing, just like the British imperial rulers did at the time. So offshore balancing, meaning the US would support India against China. But what would that do is, of course, it would only make the Chinese more angry, right? It would increase the dissatisfaction, and might actually increase the probability of conflict between both the Indians and the Chinese, which then only would drag the United States into a full-blown conflict. And of course, these are two nuclear weapon states, and then a third one with the United States. We have Taiwan and domestic problems in Hong Kong and in Tibet with regards to independence and human rights. And then geography is still very prohibitive for China, sort of to demonstrate a significant threat to the United States, right? So looking at the United States, of course, is blessed with both the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean, and of course still an unmatched superior military. So the inference here is that the US would do well not to overestimate the Chinese security threat, and it really could repeat the foreign policy blunders of the late British Empire by engaging in too much offshore balancing, using the India as a way to balance against China. Looking at domestic capacity in the challenging states. So again, looking at China, actually China, unlike India, suffers from the middle income gap. So we have a very aging population, a decline in working age population, which makes further economic development and growth a lot more difficult. If you're looking at the population, India is expected to overtake China in 2027. Of course, the state must also have the resources and the political capacity to extract those resources. That is sort of hampered in China because it's an authoritarian government, right? It's very much capitalist in economic terms, but it's very authoritarian. It's still, a communist state in political terms. So there's still a very close lid on any sort of political liberalization in China. That is a huge stumbling stone really for the China to extract and play a greater role in international relations, because it has a huge democracy deficit at home. And then looking at satisfaction. Satisfaction is very, very important. And I keep saying that throughout. So again, as Britain declined, US and France were satisfied powers, Germany was not. And sort of as we see that reality of decline sets in, panic may set in leaders of the declining power. They're assuming that, no, we're getting surpassed. Declining power means our destruction. And then they're very tempted to engage in dramatic action to prevent that. So, really that creates a sort of and create ineffective attempts at restraining the challenges. And, we have said the economic or political or military instruments of power being used to make it difficult for those rising states. So the British Empire created satisfaction with France and the United States after Napoleon's defeat, and very, very much were part of the order which Britain had, but not with Germany. So again, the US could do well by sort of replicating that, being inclusive to the rising challenges in both institutional and economic activity, and sort of avoid wars and policies that try to exclude them. Policies that would make them more dissatisfied. So as US power declines, they would do well, leaders in the United States, to emphasize the aspects of the US order, both commercially and diplomatically, that generate satisfaction, rather than engage in conflict as means of order maintenance, like the British Empire did, particularly towards Germany at the time. So what are the possible future scenarios? So one is China rises, but because of domestic constraints, it will not surpass the United States, which means that we have two rival states that sort of will be equal in power for an extended period of time. That wouldn't be really ideal. We would have two equally powerful countries that would only lead to conflict. The second option would be the United Union organizes and unifies and takes a place in international relations as the most powerful actor in international relations. Now that is possible, right? Right now it seems unlikely because the European Union is always being described as sort of economic giant but political dwarf. What if it becomes an economic and political giant? The liberal order would change. It would be led by the European Union. Again, right now we have 27 countries, 27 sovereign independent countries. They would have to strongly unify politically and act as one dominant power in international relations. So that's a lot of ifs. Third one, technological upheaval upsets the US order. So we're looking at artificial intelligence, cyber war, climate change, all of that becomes such an awesome force that even the hegemon, even the United States, is unable to really control it. And then fourthly, the US withdraws from its own order. We had the previous president under Trump, of course. We see that sort of, isolationist policies, as well as, trying to seclude the United States away from international relations and international obligations. So it would if that happens, of course, the international order would no longer be a system based on free trade, democracy, and the rule of law, and we could see a rise of an illiberal order, looking at championed by Russia or championed by China. So if you're looking at the sort of declining trust in U.S. order. Today, the sort of advocacy for withdrawal from the world is higher than it's been since the 1930s in the United States. There sort of is, of course, an aversion to intervene in politics abroad and foreign engagement. There's a reason Joe Biden said we leave Afghanistan, and previously Obama too, withdrew more or less from Iraq. So the U.S. has been in Afghanistan 20 years. So Americans are largely fed up with investing too much blood and treasure in socio-political engineering abroad. We see still opposition to neoconservative interventionism and offshore balancing. Under Trump, we also saw aversion to international commerce and free trade. Right, there was a clear farewell to free trade under Trump. America, however, seems to withdraw from the world, but continues to meddle in a series of conflicts. So if you look at Iraq, Libya, Syria, Mali, Nigeria, Somalia, Yemen, Iran, the US has its fingers somewhere there. It's right there, right? So the US, of course, still has a massive military presence overseas. And that's the thing that like the British Empire, the US sort of contradicts itself by both wanting to withdraw from the world while continuing with costly interventions without really clear objectives. And of course, we have a very, for the most part, disinterested American public, which ignores ongoing wars in international relations. So if you're looking at a few polls from 2019, whether it's best for the US to be active in world affairs or to actually less so. You see, difference between Republicans and Democrats. Question whether US should take allies' interests into account, even if that means compromising with them. Commitment to overwhelmingly say diplomacy rather than military strength is the best way to ensure peace. Republicans are here more divided. And then most say US involvement in global economy is a good thing. Younger adults, so you guys, are more likely to say that it would be acceptable for another country to rival the US as a military superpower. And then most Republicans say policies should try to maintain US superpower status. If you're looking at the US image, that's generally favorable globally, although there are some exceptions, and this is from 2019, that poll. So if we're looking at the future of the order and who's leading the 21st century, we have these two choices: one, peace, commerce, and honest friendship, and then one is promoting satisfaction. So if again, promoting commerce and honest friendship, that is Thomas Jefferson, as you might recall from the first lectures. The notion here was, or the caution: don't get entangled with others, particularly not the crazy Europeans. Stay out of Europe, and sort of to apply that to today's foreign policy. U.S. foreign policy should not try to dictate the capabilities of others, but should influence their satisfaction. So we're not looking at isolationism, but engagement via free trade, international governmental organizations, and collective security. So the notion is we must maintain the liberal order. And we also have that sort of self-reflection and come to terms that maybe the US military power cannot build countries and install democracies. Like we see in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's just not working. And then promoting satisfaction. And that is very important, again, in order to avoid the lessons, the experience of the British Empire. Let's assume that China reaches parity with the United States, which we said may not happen for the those three factors I mentioned earlier. It may actually not be dissatisfied with the status quo. If you're looking at Chinese foreign policy priorities, very much not in contradiction to the values of US foreign policy. As long as China believes the US liberal order benefits its interests, so as long as China is satisfied, it will not rock the boat too much. It will not try to challenge the United States in any way. Why should it? Because the status quo is also working for the Chinese. However, the United States and leaders in the United States could attempt to isolate and exclude China or another rising challenger from the order through different means. We mentioned about offshore balancing through India, and that of course could result in global war. That could result in a very, very bleak future for all of us.